Hello, and welcome to our second broadcast of Ferment TV. I'm Kit McDonald, and I lead special projects at Ginkgo Bioworks. I'm the creator of Ginkgo Ferment and the project director of Ferment TV. For those new to Ferment TV, we're an experimental space for virtual gatherings by Ginkgo Bioworks in partnership with London-based agency Faber Futures. We're featuring multimedia storytelling from the world of synthetic biology. We're foregrounding emerging ideas from some of the world's leading scientists, designers, industry leaders, artists, and thinkers operating at the intersection of biology, technology, and society. Thank you for accommodating our broadcast date change. Yesterday, we supported the Shutdown STEM and Shutdown Academia strike against structural racism in the STEM fields. We know that standing in solidarity is not enough. We need to continue to educate ourselves and take action to dismantle the systems of oppression that perpetuate racism and anti-Blackness. When we created Ferment TV, we knew that we'd be curating dialogues to respond in real time to the scientific, cultural, political, and societal conversations taking place around the globe. We recognize the privilege and power that we wield with this broadcast platform, and we intend to use it for the amplification of diverse voices and ideas that work toward a more equitable future. We will continue to use Ferment to broaden our understanding of how science and innovation interact with the ways we wish to live, take care of one another, and become better stewards of this planet. Now, before we get going with our conversation today, I have a few housekeeping notes that, if you joined us for our last broadcast, you'll be familiar with. This session is being recorded so that we can share it online afterward. We're looking forward to your questions, so please share them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll explore them together in the last 15 minutes of this session. We're excited by building this unique community, so we'd love your honest feedback. We'll be sending a quick survey following the session, so please send us your opinions of what you'd like to see, what you'd like to hear, what hasn't and has worked well. And finally, please stick around until the end, where I'll return to preview our guests for the next 2 weeks. Now for today's broadcast. We're focused on the theme of thriving, working together to live well together. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, Faber Futures founder and CEO Natsai Audrey Chieza, in conversation with Dr. Corrie Moreau and Anicka Yi. Our prep conversations for this broadcast evolved very quickly over the last few weeks. And the final conclusion was that no one wanted to be talking about anything other than the most pressing issue right now. We will never return to our pre-COVID world. As Anicka said, there's been too much collateral damage. We all exist in nested ecosystems, and together we need to be working toward building better communities. And with that, I'll introduce our speakers. A symbiotic organism in its own right, Anicka Yi's work fuses multi-sensory experience with synthetic and evolutionary biology to form lush biofictional landscapes. Using a biopolitics of the senses, Yi challenges traditional approaches to the human sensorium, emphasizing olfaction as well as microbial and embodied intelligence. Through her techno-sensual exploration, Yi is opening new discourse in cognition and artificial intelligence, introducing concepts of the sensorial ecology of intelligence, the machine microbiome, and biologized machines. Recent solo exhibitions include Gladstone Gallery in Brussels and the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York. Last year, Yi's work was featured in the 58th Venice Biennale, and Yi screened her film, The Flavor Genome, at the 2017 Whitney Biennial. Dr. Corrie Moreau is the Martha N. and John C. Moser Professor of Arthropod Biosystematics and Biodiversity at Cornell University in the departments of Entomology and Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. She is also the director and curator of the Cornell Insect Collection, or the Cornell University Insect Collection, with over 7 million specimens. Corrie's research on the evolution and diversification of ants and their symbiotic bacteria leverages molecular and genomic tools to address the origin of species and how co-evolved systems benefit both partners. Also, she pursues questions on the role of biogeography and symbiosis in shaping macroevolutionary processes to better understand broad-scale evolutionary patterns of life. In addition to her passion for scientific research, Corrie is also engaged with efforts to promote science communication and increase diversity in the sciences. On a personal note, I had the pleasure of working under Corrie's direction and mentorship as a high school intern, and I'm excited to witness two worlds colliding. And finally, our moderator and production collaborator, Natsai Audrey Chieza. Natsai is a Zimbabwean-born London-based designer, entrepreneur, and storyteller whose practice is deeply committed to nurturing co-designed, equitable, and biodiverse futures. She is the founder and CEO of Faber Futures, an award-winning design agency that operates at the intersection of nature, technology, and society. And with that, I will hand it over to Natsai.
Thank you so much, Kit, for that introduction. We invited Anicka and Corrie to talk to us today because we identified that they both understood ecology and biodiversity through their shared interests in microbes and the Amazon rainforest. But before we get to that, I think it's really important for me to begin by framing the current context of this conversation. Since the first known cases were reported in 2019, December of 2019, the response measures to COVID-19 upended the lives of billions of people across the world. The global lockdown measures sent economies and in some cases societal cohesion into free fall. And despite warnings from the World Health Organization, much of the world came late to the complex and the ongoing implications of being unprepared for how quickly this deadly pandemic would spread. So to date, 400,000 people are known to have died out of 7.2 million across the world. Racism has now also been characterized by many as a deadly pandemic. That white supremacy has been so instrumentalized to end lives and worlds for the last 450 years. But yet again, despite all we know about colonization, the transatlantic slave trade, industrialized genocides of civilizations, cultures, languages, knowledges, and the inherited trauma carried by our fellow citizens, we still arrive at how racism continues to systematically marginalize and kill Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color late, and how this fundamentally undermines any sense that we have meaningful efforts ongoing against ecocide and towards environmental justice. Now, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge the primary difference between the kinds of responses we've seen to these two public health emergencies. In post-industrial societies, we could almost take it for granted that our corporations, manufacturers, institutions, charities, and even individuals would step in to react to broken supply chains and even broken social contracts, repurposing infrastructure to produce everything from personal protective equipment, hand sanitizers, diagnostics, and vaccine scale-up and distribution, even giving a timeline to us all about when the world might expect to arrive at a life-saving solution. Now, responding to the public health emergency that is racism with tangible, actionable, scalable, and enduring systems for a post-racial society cannot so easily be deployed because racism, in my view, is not a pandemic, it's actually an epidemic. The very existence of the individuals, institutions, and corporations we expect to take on this responsibility is predicated, if not reliant, on the systems of oppression that the Black Lives Matter movement is calling to abolish. Therefore, the response to this emergency needs to be seen as one that is deeply rooted in a radical cultural revolution that asks how we create new ecologies of thought that can beget action to bring about the kinds of social and environmental justices the people of this world now demands. So I'd like to start, Anicka, by exploring this notion of crisis response. I know that you've turned a lot of your efforts to responding to both COVID-19 and anti-racism work. Can you share with us what is compelling you to do this, and what sorts of strategies you're using?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Natsai, for inviting me this afternoon. I want to thank Ginkgo Bioworks, Ferment TV, and Corrie to be in conversation. It's funny, a friend of mine jokingly referred to me as the as COVID-19's publicist, because I've been on somewhat of a speaking tour about the virus. You know, I really felt compelled to try to talk about the virus in a way that wasn't based out of fear and reaction. And even the term pandemic sort of makes me uneasy, because it's a very human-centric, a human-forward kind of reaction and concern. But that being said, from what I've learned about viruses, you know, humans, we contain 8% of it in our DNA, in our genome. And you know, viruses predate life, and so they really kind of they're not technically living, but they predate life, and that really complicates this dialectic between living, non-living, and what that means for you know, machine intelligence and other kinds of technologies that I am interested in my practice, as well as other organic life and microbial intelligence as well. So so I think that I needed to really unpack those kinds of urgent sort of questions around surrounding this virus. And I think that we're all given such an incredible education at the moment about how to rethink what the human is, how to rethink what nature is. And then a few weeks ago, the volcano erupted of these, you know, really horrific, basically public torturous lynchings. And you really, they're inseparable to me in terms of an urgency, because so much of how and why this is happening, the systemic racism, is really at the core of how we coexist biologically, ecologically, environmentally, all of those things. It's inseparable. I mean, you can think about, you know, but then just one has to just sort of peel back the layers and realize that, you know, what is a nation state if not a racial construct? You know, I believe that I mean, although the definition of race and racism isn't a modern phenomenon in terms of modernity. It predates it, but you know, it was really in the 17th century that the concept of race and racism emerged from white Europeans, ostensibly, and it was a way to try to counterpoint what isn't white, and to sort of highlight, you know, the whiteness, as it were. And so I think that, like, from what I'm trying to learn, along with the rest of the world, and along with the rest of the non-Black world, is to try to wake up and understand that you know, a nation is constructed through a racial lens, and that America is no exception to that. And every facet of life in America is permeated with racism, from housing, education, religion, banking, you know, like athletics, art, religion. It's all bundled in. There is no escape. And I think that non-Black people in America were not aware, or chose not to be aware of this. And this is something that we really have to address. This is not something that you can just put a Band-Aid over and just kind of get on with it, because you know, this is, it also is different than maybe, you know, uprisings in the 60s, civil rights movement, because of the awareness, the internet, and also of the pernicious administration that we have in power at the moment. So there, I think we're all really at a moment of reckoning and having to atone to a self-accountability, first and foremost, in thinking about these issues and how that reflects into my practice as an artist, and the areas that I'm interested. There's no border that can seal off those issues as as we are a social group. I don't like the word or term species that much. I mean, maybe Corrie, we can have a debate about that someday. But I feel like the concept of species is very limiting, and it creates these sort of very loose boundaries that when we are actually very porous entities. So anyway, I don't want to take up too much time, but it's an urgency that I'm hearing.
I think it probably reflects how a lot of people are feeling about this, that it's so tied to any sense of what happens in a post-COVID-19 world. It has to be able to absorb everything that we are going through right now.
Mm-hmm.
Corrie, Kit mentioned earlier that the reason why we moved this conversation a day later was to create space for shut down academia, shut down STEM. And I was hoping that you might be able to tell us a little bit about this, about the movement and how you personally sort of responded yesterday to it.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think the point that we all know that racism is systematic, despite the fact that we like to think in science that we're unbiased and that we, tackle every problem with, a clear mind, we know that that's not in fact true. And so even within academia and within the science, technology, and engineering fields, we know in mathematics, we know that there still is racism and bias. And so what the people of the Black community within our fields said is that we need to take a moment and pause. We need to take this moment so that Black people have a moment to breathe and rejuvenate, and the rest of us have work to do. And so the idea is we should spend the day educating ourselves and coming up with actionable plans as to how we can make a difference and sort of fluid conversation so that it's no longer just pointing out problems, but it's trying to find solutions. And so on a personal level, myself and my lab, we all agreed that we would take the day off. It's not a business as usual day, no emails, no, unless it's related to sort of trying to solve the problem of racism in academia, and especially in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Really, it was about educating ourselves and reading and having conversations and trying to follow a discussion that's happening. And there's a lot of resources out there, and realizing that the onus should not be on people of color to educate us, that we need to take the initiative to sort of say, it's out there. You can Google it, you can get on social media. Trust me, there is a lot to learn, and to use those moments to educate ourselves. And as someone who has worked for a long time on trying to diversify science, it was really important. And even as someone who is actively trying to sort of overcome some of these issues, I still have learning to do, I still have growing to do. And so I used yesterday to try to sort of shorten that gap so that I could actually also be a resource in the community, so that, when people have questions, if they don't feel always comfortable going to others, maybe I can help sort of point people in directions. So I think really what we're trying to do is, especially within the sciences, it's a place where we do pride ourselves on being objective and really trying to get at the source of the true answer to the question, that we ourselves have some shopkeeping to do to make it a welcoming environment.
And Corrie, we talked about the parallels between the individual needing to take account of and work towards a lifelong practice of abolition of racism, versus the institution as a body, as a powerful body, doing the same. We talked about the parallels between that and the environmental movement, where it is also individualized. People are told to recycle their garbage, and yet there seems to be a gap between the action I can make as an individual versus how the state operates in its capacity to create the infrastructures we need to be able to meet individual action with the global view of the thing. And I'm just wondering, for you, And given how much work you've been doing over the years already in this as an individual, what is that gap between what you are able to do versus what the institution can put in place? Do you see this as a dichotomy, or do you see this otherwise?
I have a lot of differing opinions about it. I think because I study symbiotic systems and because I think about how organisms interact in nature, both for sort of the larger scale, like how they are in their environment, whether it's in a rainforest and all the plants and organisms they're interacting with, or whether it's the microbes nested within a single host that's acting essentially, the host is the ecosystem. I think because I tend to think of how all interacting organisms need to contribute to have a healthy ecosystem. It's the way I tend to think about these kinds of, sort of issues within my own institutions. I do feel like, of course, each individual must do, what they can to contribute, but they are nested within this larger ecosystem. And for myself, I'm nested within institutions of, science and education. And so really I have to figure out how I can invoke change through that. One of the things I've experienced is that any initiative I've put forward, as long as it wasn't coming from a self-serving place, the institution has always been receptive to those. They often don't know where to go, right? And so they know they need to change, but they aren't exactly sure how to implement it. So if people have, ideas and not just like pointing at problems, but have solutions, they're almost always receptive. I think one thing that most institutions need to do is to acknowledge that they have a diversity problem, and they need to actually make sure that they're creating a truly inclusive environment where it's not just that you need to put the diversity there, you need to actually make all ideas and all people welcome. And so I think that that sort of is one of the first steps that are often overlooked. People now know, like, tick, I need to have diversity, and then that's often where it ends, but they aren't thinking about whether the environment they're creating is actually welcoming the things that come with a diverse community. Is it that we want all of the ideas to be the same, we just want people to look different? And if that's the choice, then I feel like we're not going to actually realize all the potential for the ways that we can solve problems. And that's certainly true in science, and I think it's true across every field. But I think that what we need to do is we need to say, and there's a whole body of literature from the business world and the science world that when you put diverse kinds of people together, you get better solutions, you get more creative solutions, you get faster problem solving, and you get higher impact. And so all of those things already tell us, and if you look at nature, it already tells us that having diversity and having diverse ecosystems are the most resilient. And so I think we just need to take a page from nature and sort of, instead of seeing ourselves as outside of nature, we have to recognize that we are part of nature. And Anicka's point, when we were chatting earlier, COVID really points out that we really are still part of nature. Even if we live in these giant cities and these human-made structures, we are still part of nature.
Thank you so much, Corrie, for that. It brings me to my next question about intersectionality, and I put this in because I think it sort of represents the complexities of science making, the complexities of art making in the world that we live in now, when we are confronted with how everything's connected. Both of you are dealing with intersectionality through your practices. You're collaborating with living beings, and you're working across disciplines and across different types of institutions. Anicka, how has this approach, this sensibility, shaped your thinking, and how does it come to influence your artistic mediums?
I think that I'm really deeply pondering what nature is, and not to have some kind of ontological explanation of what nature is to replace the former ontological argument, but just that what are the lessons that COVID is giving us, forcing us to listen to. And one of the things that I'm starting to think is that of course nature is not just this place of origin for human beings that we emerged from, and then we created our own sort of anthropogenic worlds. It's that nature has always been with us. We've always been a part of it. It's inseparable from any sort of biological entity, for that matter. And so I think that what I'm finding is that the notions of nature are inadequate. Pre-COVID, they were fairly inadequate, and now absolutely they feel really inadequate. And I think we really need to start thinking about, how to regard and articulate nature in a way that actually understands that there is no real separation, and that perhaps that all there is really nature. Even, our machines and our space shuttles and these very elaborate, sophisticated technologies that humans create. But then that's not a complete idea either, though, because we have to articulate who we are as human beings, and that the definition of who we are, and moving into COVID era has been inadequate, has been very inadequate. The idea that we are separate from nature and more than mere nature is a very 19th century antiquated definition of what a human is. And so, it's a very powerful kind of, for lack of a better term, equation, right? What is the human today and what is nature today, and how that influences my thinking is, and my practice as an artist is for one thing, just on a very practical level. I've been collaborating with other kinds of species and organisms, whether they're microbes or carpenter ants. And I find that for me, I've eliminated a need for metaphor and representation. I don't need something to stand in for ants, and I don't need something to stand in for microbes. I just work with them. Maybe I don't have a consent forms exactly. But I think that with art in our milieu, it is so very kind of caught up in this sort of web of representation and metaphor, and I find that I feel incredible liberation and emancipation, that I don't really have to have that stand in that complication, that extra step, when I can just go straight to the source and merge with nature, and not have to overcomplicate and stay in my sort of sort of human supremacist lane. And so that's been a direct impact in my thinking and my practice, and also but also attending to the social sort of, I guess, the social crisis in response to COVID-19. And that's been, I have to say, I don't even know if I'm qualified to even, comment on how that's impacting me at the moment, because I just feel this enormous shedding, just shedding layer after layer after layer, as I start to understand how the world really works. I mean, I thought I knew a few things, and here we are, and I just didn't see it. And I'm stunned at how deeply rooted all of this xenophobia and racism and injustice is so interlocked, and how racism is good for the economy. This is why we perpetuate it, how intrinsically tied it is to capitalism, and the history of oppression and capitalism go hand in hand. So it's a lot to absorb and metabolize, but if we don't start thinking about this, then all we're doing is just virtue signaling, and we will find ourselves right back where we are 10 years from now, 5 years from now, and very little will change. It will just be surface concessions, but really no shift of power.
And yet we can start to think and look to nature for other models, perhaps. I wondered, Corrie, if you could tell us about your experiences in the Amazon. You've done field work there. And at some point, that field work turns into lab work, and it then transforms into archival work. Could you tell us, how that is functioning as part of your practice?
Right. So I think when I first started as a scientist, I felt like I needed to narrowly focus. I needed to figure out a system or a question and really sort of pursue that. And very quickly, and I think most scientists arrive at this same realization, is that you really can't pull something out of nature or observe it in nature solely alone. You have to account for the fact that it's part of this very intricate fabric of the environment in which it's in. And so most of my work is focused on insects. Ants are what I study. And so when I'm in the rainforest, of course, that's what draws my eye first. But I realized quickly that I couldn't just think about the ants alone. I had to think about what plants were they climbing on, and why was that the preferred substrate? What were they feeding on? Was it other animals like insects, or was it plants? And how did that sort of shift both their ecology, like what they're doing right now, but also on a larger sort of evolutionary scale, how has that sort of shifted their evolutionary history? Do we see that when you shift onto a novel diet that there's a new niche open that you can diversify? Or is it that sometimes you do a shift and then it actually constrains you and you're sort of unable to diversify? And I think that most of my questions in my own research now come from observations in nature. And I don't mean that I set out to see that observation. It's that I'm there, and I might think I'm pursuing one question, and then something will catch your eye, or something will kind of tickle at the back of your head as you're pursuing that, and you say, wait a minute, I'm not accounting for something. And so really you have to go back and reframe your questions. Now, of course, I am completely inspired by doing work in the field. But because most of my work is based in evolutionary biology and using sort of molecular DNA tools and genomics, I then bring those organisms back to the lab, sometimes to do continued experiments, but sometimes just to do the molecular parts of the work, to use those tools to address the questions that I've formulated in the field. But again, as being the director and head curator of a natural history collection, I also think about sort of preservation and long-term sort of access to nature. And, people often ask me, like, if you're so passionate and you love nature so much, why do you want to kill it and then put it in, in a box, in a room? But I also recognize that natural history collections are some of the most powerful scientific tools we have available to us as windows into the past, as understanding the diversity we're seeing today, and for predicting what we expect to have happen in the future based on sort of what we're doing to the environment. And it's without those specimens, we actually can't ask those kinds of questions. We need to understand something about what does diversity look like, meaning in all of its shapes and forms, but we also want to know, how does diversity change through time? So we can't say that, an organism's range has, reduced because of human encroachment without showing that it was there before. And that's where natural history collections come in. In addition, there are these enormously beneficial genetic resources. So we can actually ask questions like, has this species gone through a genetic bottleneck? We can return to those specimens in, natural history collections around the world and say, what did genetic diversity look like 100 years ago? Is it really, much less now? Or has a pathogen come in and sort of changed the sort of demographics of that species? We can even ask questions about the microbes associated with those specimens in the past all the way through the current system. We can then use those data to make predictions in future modeling about what we expect to have happen. So for me, I sort of see it as this legacy of sort of what we're doing now, but sort of acknowledging what we've done in the past and trying to use that to be informative about how we think about nature and humans embedded within it into the future.
Thank you, Corrie. Anicka, I'd like to ask you a question to tap into what Corrie just shared with us on legacy. How does legacy manifest in your work? So much of it is living. How do conservators deal with that?
Well, when I first started working with these sort of what they would call volatile materials. You know, I would get summoned into the conservator's office, like being reprimanded by the principal at school or something like that. And it was actually wonderful because I would have these really thoughtful, fascinating conversations with conservators around this kind of paradoxical question. And then it slowly became deeply integrated into my practice, thinking about conservation before the big idea in terms of, you know, something creative or conceptual. And I think that I've embraced it so much as a part of my discourse as getting out in front, temporality, you know, instead of waiting for something to deteriorate. You know, let's talk about the instability of these materials, the precariousness, you know, the entropic nature of these materials. And I think that that is sort of a very driving engine in the work that I explore and try to make. And so I would say that, like, from a feminist slant, I was adamantly against these monumental works that are supposed to last beyond multiple human lifetimes, and, you know, that the male brain would come up with something monumental and it would be this totem to our species and our existence. And I didn't really agree with that, and so I was kind of working in an opposite sort of time scale, and, you know, I think I'm fascinated by thinking about different timescales. You know, I mean, Corrie, you're talking about these different sort of symbiotic ecologies with the you know, organisms you study, and to me, I think about that as well in a way that really humbles the human timescale. We often measure everything we understand and want to know according to a human timescale, when so much of what is in coexistence with us and on our bodies, because what constitutes a human being as we know it is a multi-species consortium. That is what we are. We are living examples of this entanglement. It's not just something we can say philosophically and theoretically. We are an embodied example of that. And so when I think about that, you know, these microbes have been around for billions of years, and to think about what is beneath the surface of this kind of like the visibility for humans and, quite frankly, human interest. So I think about that in terms of you know, to your point or question about legacy, you know, like let's link up different timescales that are not so you know, based on human interest and human quantifiable timescales. And so I just, maybe I'm not making work exclusively for human beings, and maybe I'm interested in an art that can also be shared in a multi-species way. You know, art is a largely a human endeavor, and I get asked this a lot, like, where do you see art going in 50 to 100 years? And if I had to speculate, you know, perhaps it won't be an exclusively human project, art.
Gosh, that's really fascinating. I'm just looking at the Q&A, and there's a question here I think that links really nicely with what you're touching on. It's from Dai. The question is, how are some of the ways we can engage with wider audiences with important connections between systemic racism and natural ecology without perpetuating capitalistic languages and systems? And in a way, that's that question of even how we see art. If we start to see other embodiments, how do we conceptualize it? Do you have any thoughts on that, Anicka?
I will try. I think it starts with, again, accountability. I think you have to start thinking about how we are all complicit in a lot of these institutional sort of ways of thinking around racism, and we're benefiting from racism and we don't even realize it. And I think we really need to start interrogating what is at the root of all of this, you know. And I find that a lot of people are, you know, non-Black people are focusing on, you know, Black culture and the Black plight. And I would also add, like, please interrogate whiteness, because that is so much more at the core of our issues and less about, solidarity and allyship with the Black community. Yes, that's important, but we need to move past that solidarity to actual actionable plans. And so how do we move past that with art? We have to hold our institutions accountable, and not just post a black square on their Instagram grid. We need to ask for demand diversity. We need to and how to decouple that from capitalism. I don't have a grand plan, but I do think that while I'm not any particular party in particular, I think social democracy has proven to be successful in many instances. I think we need redistribution of wealth, education, healthcare, basic building blocks of how any human being can thrive. And these are issues that need to be addressed within the art world as well. The art world has an amazing pattern of hiding behind art, the morality behind art. So, you take a very compelling, powerful political art piece, and then you throw it up in your museums, your galleries, on your Instagram feed, and you say, yes, this is going to speak for me. That's not good enough. It really isn't. You have to interrogate, like, what are you doing, behind the art, and what is your offline life about? And because, the art world, just like any other, milieu, is a social group, and we need to, address a lot of our own systemic prejudices and problems.
Practices, ongoing practices. Do you have anything to add to that, Corrie?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting to hear Anicka's perspective on it from the art world, because I feel like the sciences and academia in general suffers from a lot of the same things. What we're told is to, and I don't mean that, there's any one person saying it, it's sort of just the conversation around the work we do, is that you're supposed to focus on your discipline. And that, as a scientist, that my job is to focus on my discipline, my science, and that, all of the political conversations and all of the making sure that my science is accessible, that's not my job. My job is just to generate scientific data, interpret it, and then share it with my colleagues. And I've pushed back on that for a long time, and a lot of people have, but there still is a discourse that, conversations around societal issues and social justice, and even making your own science accessible to the public, those are often looked down upon as if that, why would you waste your time doing those things? You need to focus. And, I've certainly been the receiver of that kind of conversation in the past, because I have worked so hard. I work incredibly hard in my science, and I'm driven by it because I'm passionate about it and I love what I do. But I also want to be able to tell anyone that I meet anywhere in the world about what I do and why. And so I have to learn to shift my language so that I can actually become accessible. And that's not something you can just flip a switch on. You actually have to actively work at it. It's called science communication. And so I've worked a lot at it. I think that people are beginning to value it more. But now again, during this whole discourse, people have asked the question, is it in the purview of a scientist to engage in conversations around social justice? But I would argue it absolutely is. It's fundamentally at the root. If we really want to end up with the best science that we could possibly produce, we have to dismantle this structure of white male supremacy in our fields, because you ask anyone to draw a scientist, and what do? They draw Einstein or some version of that. And recognizing that someone like me or any of you are what scientists look like, I think is one of the big surprises, is that people have stereotypes. We all know that. But if we can sort of continue to push the boundaries, those stereotypes start to fall apart. And I do think that that is one of the requirements of scientists, is to connect with people and become a welcoming place where truly innovative science can happen.
I'm going to ask a question that maybe we haven't quite discussed yet, but we've been talking a lot about the diversity of the people who are at the table, but also the diversity of thinking that they actually bring to the table. And to what extent, Corey, do you think that beyond changing who's there, what we also have to start to do is to essentially decolonize ecology, decolonize the institution, the way we teach, the languages we use? Is that a discourse at all that you're interfacing with at all?
Absolutely. I think that people have been aware of these issues for a long time. And there has been active movement to try to improve academia, both in the context of who's at the table and what kind of research we're doing, but also how are we teaching and what audiences are we reaching? Are we teaching the most appropriate way for diverse audiences? So, you know, a lot of people have sort of moved from this lecture-based, I stand in the front, I, you know, spout at you and I might have some slides with some data on them, to a more active learning classroom where it's much more student-led, you know, participant engaging. And there's actually been many studies that have demonstrated that that's where you capture the most learning for the broadest audiences. And so many institutions are already switching their learning formats to that. I think that, of course, we all want to see change immediately, right? We want the world to be the place we want it to be. But I don't want to ignore that lots of people have been actively working to make our institutions better. Do I think we have a long way to go? Absolutely. But I do think that people are trying to sort of acknowledge that they haven't been, you know, bastions of welcoming and diversity and inclusivity that we would like to see. And so I think that we will see change, and I hope that this movement is really going to sort of make it happen at a faster pace, because one of the things we know that is, if we let it keep slowly evolving at the pace that it is, that it'll take almost 100 years to reach anything close to equity. And, you know, that's clearly not acceptable. So I think I'm hopeful that, because now the conversations are out in the open, people are having them, it's making a lot of people very uncomfortable. And I think that's an okay thing. Like, you know, that the way you grow is by learning and being put in an uncomfortable position.
Mm-hmm. I have a very specific question from Hannah Hidalgo. She asks, in what ways are you planning to incorporate more diversity into your research? And I wonder if Hannah can just elaborate a little bit on what she means by more diversity into the research. I'm assuming she means into the people who are involved, but perhaps she means something else, perhaps the research areas that you're actually exploring. We can wait on her to clarify, but in the meantime, perhaps you can address the specificities of how that can actually be achieved.
Sure, absolutely. I sort of feel like you have to start at home and then you can sort of build up. And so in my own research team, we are an incredibly diverse group of people. I've always valued that diversity. And I think that that brings the most creative ideas and the most diverse, not just questions, but approaches. And I love that. I love, you know, being sort of knocked off of my path by someone pointing out like, hey, we could do it this way. And it had never occurred to me. And so I think having, you know, really diverse people around me personally is the first step. I'll say that it doesn't stop there. So I've been involved with creating change within our own scientific societies. I've served on diversity, inclusion, and equity committees. I've sort of pushed scientific societies to acknowledge when they're not doing right and how we can actually take steps to improve. I've actually created programming around diversity, so created opportunities for people who are underrepresented in the sciences to get hands-on experiences and paid situations so that we can open up the community so that more people feel like they belong. I've even started incorporating some conversations around diversity in my own teaching. So I'm teaching a course on the science of bias and what do we know about human scientific endeavors through the lens of equity and diversity. And so I think that all of us have to be making all the steps we can in all the ways we can, but also holding our institutions accountable and really pushing them to make change, and not just our sort of home institution, meaning like where we work, but maybe the broader community in which we're embedded, and of course our own countries and our own cities and our own, the planet itself. So I think, really sort of taking a moment to sort of look at yourself and evaluate how are you contributing to a solution and where are you creating problems, and then working up and never stopping.
I'm just getting a message from Hannah here, sort of confirming that she meant social diversity. So thank you for sending that through. But I think we have time for maybe one last question. And I thought I could ask Anicka, and it's maybe a little bit of a cliche to ask, what is the role of art today? I'm sure every artist has been asked that, but at this particular moment, when we are looking at, there's no return to pre-COVID-19 world, but we are also looking at this great social upheaval. What role, I'm asking the question, does the artist play? And yeah, maybe you can just elaborate on that for us.
I don't have any prescriptive answer for every artist. One thing I've learned about artists is that there's a different model for every artist that exists in the world. So no two are really alike. I think for myself, what I do is I practice a philosophy, but by a different means, through art. And I think right now artists need to be thinking as philosophers, thinking as activists, thinking as demanding the rigorous, the impossible. It's what we do. We have the audacity to enter into realms that we know nothing about, and then we just start tinkering. And because we are often so light on our feet, I like to joke that we're these single-celled organisms, and we don't have these like large clunky boards and trustees, or we don't have to worry about getting grants to do our work. We just do it, and we have an idea from conception to execution can be a very short amount of time. And so with that nimble mobility, that kind of lean way of tackling problems and that seem insurmountable and dense, and like what Corrie was saying, change is going to be slow, and I'll add to that, Corrie, messy and scary and all of those things, but artists have these tools already. We know how to actualize things, and this is where we get in and be vigorous with these kinds of I don't know, to put it really bluntly, problem solving. This is what we do all day. We think of ideas and how to approach them from omnidirectional points of view, and we tackle it. And we are not intimidated by the impossible when scientists, sorry, Corrie, or engineers tell us, no, you can't do that. That's not possible. This is not possible in this realm of reality. And we say, well, we're going to find a different way of making that happen. And I'll just give you a little anecdote, not to be self-promotional, but I approached, for my Guggenheim show, I approached a team of synthetic biologists, and I asked them, I'd love to create a drug, an actual drug that you could take so that a human being like myself could experience the perception of a pink dolphin in the Brazilian Amazon. How do I do that? Can you help me do that? And they kind of humored me for a few minutes, and they said, well, physically that's just impossible. Biologically that's impossible. You'd have to reshape your brain to match the brain of a pink dolphin and this and that. And so I thought, okay, interesting, but I didn't want to give up on that. And so I adapted that idea, and instead I created a scent that I wanted to kind of think of as a drug, you know, a scented olfaction drug, where I created a hybrid entity of an Asian American female with a carpenter ant smell. And the idea was that visitors to the exhibition would inhale and engage in this transcorporeal exchange and hope that this perception, this multi-species collaborative perception would yield some empathy.
Boom. Well, I think we've come down to our last couple of minutes. I just wanted to thank you both, Anicka and Corrie, for this really, really wonderful conversation and the conversations we've had in the lead up to it. I've thoroughly enjoyed engaging with you on this and the moving target that we're sort of living through. So thank you. And thank you to everybody who has tuned in today to this conversation.
I'll close for you, Natsai. I just wanted to say, as soon as I handed the mic over to the three of you, it just started pouring outside my apartment and it hasn't let up. So I feel like that it was very good foreboding for this powerful conversation that's just ensued. So I want to thank the three of you so much for this beautiful conversation. I would love to thank Christina from the Ginkgo Bioworks team. And on the Faber Future side, a shout out to Laura Vent, Joanna Mann, Camille Thierry, Magda Obmalko, and our graphic designer, Marta Ubez. And as promised, I'd love to give everyone a preview of our next 2 weeks for Ferment TV. So next Wednesday, we'll feature Dr. Sarah Richardson in conversation with Natsai on how wild microbes and new metaphors can change the prevailing narratives and inequitable outcomes of the synthetic biology industry. Together, they will explore how the wild-type organism provides new conceptual and practical frameworks to better identify the technological context, scale-up, and investment models that could enable a more equitable biotechnology industry to emerge. And in 2 weeks, we'll be featuring Dr. Alondra Nelson, President of the Social Science Research Council and Harold F. Linder Chair in the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study, and Dr. Joan Donovan, Research Director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. They will speak with Christine Agapakis about racism as a public health issue and the social dimensions of pandemics. Please visit ferment.tv to sign up for our newsletter to keep up to date with forthcoming broadcasts and for links to our Twitter and Instagram social feeds. Thank you for joining us today, everyone, and take care.